Hey everyone, welcome to JDMD, the show where we talk about everything from injections to objections. I'm Baka-Raptor, a lawyer based in Tokyo, and with me is Allopathasaurus, a doctor based in the United States. What's up?
Hey, this is Allopathasaurus, MD, reporting from the Western Hemisphere. Great to be
Hey,
here.
yeah, it's nice to have you. So usually when we do an episode like this, JDMD, we talk about one legal issue and one medical issue. But this time around, we're going to skip the legal issue and instead talk about my experience volunteering at the Olympics and Paralympics just over the past 2 months. And then we'll talk about sort of piggybacking on the whole issue of volunteering. We'll talk about our experiences volunteering at a hospital back when we were in high school. And spoiler, I kind of hated it, but we have a doctor here who's been working in many different hospital environments. Maybe he'll have something different to say about it. All right. So let's start talking about the Olympics. First thing I want to know, did you get around to watching any?
So I did watch some of the Olympics. With that said, it is a little bit difficult to watch on the other side of the world because there's just so many different events, so many different channels that everything's broadcasted on. So there were a lot of events I was looking for and they just didn't play on the networks that I usually watch, and with work and everything.
Yeah.
Bottom line, I tried to catch what I could, but I probably missed a lot of it.
All right. Yeah. I mean, of course, there's the whole time zone issue going from Tokyo to the East Coast of the United States. But I mean, it's not something that new. I mean, for example, the Olympics were in Korea for the Winter Olympics just 2 or 3 years ago. And then they were in Beijing for the Summer Olympics, I believe in 2008. So we should be used to the whole time zone thing by now. But yeah, I understand that if you want to catch events live, at least, it's a huge problem. What Olympic events specifically were you able to catch? I, for example, from here, I saw a little bit of everything, but a little bit of everything that the Japanese team was in, because from the Japanese TV networks, they tend to just focus on whatever Japan's doing well in or has participants in before going to basically anything else. So did you catch anything like Taekwondo, for example? I know you're into that. So did you catch any of that?
I caught a little bit of it. Mostly it was on YouTube and other recaps and whatnot. So I did see some Taekwondo. I saw a little bit of swimming. I saw a little bit of, what was it? Some other event that I'm blanking on right now. Maybe diving. I think that's what it was. But I think those were the big ones that we're really focused on this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's cool. I mean, we were both on the swimming/diving team back in high school, although we just did the swimming part. But yeah, that's one of the things that I look forward to in every Olympic year, or every summer Olympic year at least, because that's the one sport that I really have a good sense of what's world class in based on all our experience in it. And yeah, there were all of Japanese participants in that as well. Just to give you an idea of how Japanese coverage is, in a typical swimming event, there are 8 participants, and first, second, and third get gold, silver, and bronze, right? But instead of talking about the top 2 swimmers who might be from a different country, the Japanese announcers are pretty much going to be talking about the person in 5th or 6th place who's from Yamanashi Prefecture in Japan and has this whole background story of how they became a great swimmer despite the odds. And the US coverage, typically, it's more focused on the best of the best, regardless of what country they're from. And that's in part because the United States typically has good competitors in every single event. But also, I think it's a difference in mindset that they try to be, I guess, more fair in their coverage to all the other countries as well. But yeah, one of the things that I heard about NBC is that first of all, splitting up all the different events on different channels, like the TV channels, the internet channels, that was all over the place and no one really knew where to look. And another thing that I heard that I think is a fair criticism is that they would cut to commercials with really bad timing for all kinds of events, like right in the middle of certain events, especially if they were covering them live. So that was probably also annoying, but once again, I didn't see any of that, so I can't say firsthand. Anyway. So yeah, so I want to talk about my experience volunteering at the Olympics over the past 2 months. And I guess we can take this chronologically, starting with the whole application process through, my final days of the Paralympics just less than a month ago. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me, because I saw everything from the inside and I might see things from a different viewpoint as you. So if there's anything you're curious about, just go ahead and ask me. But yeah, I guess we can start right ahead with the application process, right? So Well, let me ask you, what do you think? If you were filling out an application for being a volunteer with the Olympics, what kind of information would you expect to have to submit?
Okay, so I would expect it to be at least some security clearance, considering these are some celebrity athletes from all around the world.
Okay, that is actually a huge one and one that a lot of people do overlook. I'm going to get into that when I talk about the Paralympics because my security clearance for that was actually pretty damn high. But yeah, security is actually a big issue. Okay, cool. So what else do you think you might have to put in the application?
Okay, probably asking me, my background knowledge of various different sporting events and the rules and things like that.
Okay, yeah, that's also a pretty big one, or at least you would think it would be a pretty big one. But in the whole application that you had to fill out for the original, the initial online application, there was only one small section dedicated to what sport you might actually end up in. They asked you to list 3 sports that you had some sort of background with, and then just basically asked you how many years and what level of background. So, for example, swimming, I might have put down 5 to 10 years and, junior high school through high school. And that was the only Olympic event that I had any serious background in, because thinking about the Olympic events, I hadn't started karate at the time. And also karate was just at this year's Olympics. It's not going to be at the next one in France. The host country gets to decide up to 5 events that they want to introduce, and otherwise they have to pick from the standard roster. So I hadn't been doing karate when I filled out the application initially in late 2018. So that's actually how long this has been, like October or so from 2018 until now, almost 3 years. But yeah, the other 2 sports that I listed, I put down tennis because I did have some tennis experience from high school, but not that much. We grew up with a lot of spoiled rich kids, so they were all much better at tennis than me. I only played for 2 years. And the third Summer Olympic sport that I listed was basketball, which we've played a lot for fun, but I've never played on an organized team. So I didn't expect any placement for that, or from tennis, because a lot of people in Japan do like tennis and probably played at a much higher level than me. But I really thought I was going to get some sort of swimming position. And I did end up being on swimming for the Paralympics, but not the Olympics. For the Olympics, I was ultimately chosen for beach volleyball, and I still have no idea how I ended up with that, but I'm not complaining. I think it's a fun sport and all, but why even bother with the application if that's, where I'm going to end up? Didn't quite get that. But yeah, it was actually a much smaller part of the application than I'd originally expected, what sport background I had. All right, so aside from what sport and kind of general information so they could verify your backgrounds and give you a security clearance, yeah, it's just a lot of, personality question type stuff, like what kind of stuff would you find fun to do for volunteer work, like whether it's interacting with other people or driving or doing paperwork. I think one of the most in-demand positions was driving related positions because not many people in the Tokyo area drive. Public transportation is huge here. And even if they do have a driver's license, they probably have very little experience. And the roads in any urban area are going to be kind of annoying to navigate your way around. So that was in pretty high demand. I did not volunteer for a driving position. I specifically did not put in a request for that. But I put in kind of in my list of preferences for what kind of position I might find, fulfilling. One of them would be like event services, so like setting up or taking down equipment at events, guiding people around, and hopefully being able to catch some of the events myself, although that's not really a legitimate reason to want to participate. But yeah, I wanted to participate at the event sites. Another thing that I put down was, I wanted to help with like, interacting with like tourists, perhaps like guiding people around, even if it was not in the event venue itself. So maybe standing outside a train station and helping guiding people to the station, or helping people, find their way around a stadium, even if I'm not in a position where I can actually see the events going on. And I forgot what the other thing that I put down was. I think like translation services. And I thought maybe I could end up being some sort of translator or interpreter, but there were actually a lot of really good interpreters there. I've worked in the Japanese school system. I've seen Japanese people who teach English as a profession, and their level is really not that high. But a lot of people I interacted with in the Olympic volunteering who were Japanese and occasionally had to speak English for some reason, they were actually really competent. So Yeah. I mean, I could rant about the whole English education system in Japan for days, but at least some people got it right, and some people were actually highly competent at speaking English. So thankfully, they did all that interpretation and not me because they were better than me. I can say that quite safely. All right. So, yeah, back in October of 2018, I filled out that application online, and then nothing happened for a while. I got, an email back saying that they reviewed my application and they're interested in, giving me more information about volunteering. And I think at this stage, pretty much like to get the Olympics going, they need a lot of volunteers. I think the estimate was for a proper Olympics where they have tourists and people from out of the country who are allowed to watch events. Basically, there were no general spectators at this year's Olympics, although there were special visitors and yeah, they had some level of spectators being allowed in, but that was on a very case-by-case basis. But in a proper Olympics, that might have 80,000 to 110,000 volunteers necessary to keep the whole thing running. So you'd think beggars can't be choosers. They have to accept everyone who applies. But there is one person I knew who was rejected. She's a Japanese girl who's like a college student. Most of the volunteers that I came across were either college students or like senior citizens who were retired, so they had a lot of free time to be able to help out with this. So this girl, she was studying abroad in England, and she had plans to be back in Japan by the time the Olympics started in 2020, but I guess they couldn't rely on that, so they rejected her. But some of the other Olympic volunteers that I worked with, they were from all over the country, not just the Tokyo area, but they were from like Aomori, Iwate, other parts of Japan that are kind of far from Tokyo. So distance didn't seem like it had to be an issue. I had no idea what you would actually have to do to get rejected from at least the first stage of the volunteer application. But yeah, apparently some people did get rejected. But after that, they called you in for like an in-person interview, and at that time, they did some like stupid team building exercise thing just to get everyone familiarized with each other and to get everyone talking and feeling comfortable, and did like a really short interview about what your goals were, why you wanted to volunteer. Just, I think the whole thing, once again, was just kind of a sanity check. They didn't really use that as a basis for really scrutinizing whether you should participate in the Olympics or not. Just wanted to see whether you're someone who can get along with other people, and they want to, in that kind of Olympic environment. So that was probably about a half year since my original application. Then they passed out uniforms. I'm actually wearing one of the official shirts that I have here, and I have a few extras, so I can actually bring one of them to you as a souvenir next time I see you. But yeah, I have you got your uniforms. You had a lot of online training sessions after that because yeah, because of the whole COVID thing, they pretty much cut all of the in-person interviews and exercises after that initial one. And yeah, after that, you were finally assigned your specific role about 3 or 4 months before the Olympics. So a lot of time actually passed before knowing that I was going to be in beach volleyball for the Olympics and swimming for the Paralympics. And I would say that all of the training that took place from the initial application process until you got your specific role assignment was completely unnecessary and a waste of time because, yeah, really all the knowledge you need to be able to volunteer properly is for your one specific role. You don't need to know background information about the Olympics, their whole history, about general information about other venues and that sort of thing. So yeah, I ignored a lot of the online training, to be honest, but turns out I didn't really need any. All right, so then there was the whole delay, right? Going from 2020 to 2021. Just curious, what's your opinion on the whole thing? Postponing the Olympics for 1 year because of COVID pandemic, and then having it in 2021, despite the numbers around the summer of 2021 being significantly higher than they were in summer 2020, at least in Japan.
Okay, well, I do think hindsight is always 2020.
Yeah.
No pun intended. Exactly. So I will say that numbers aside, I do think there was a much different understanding of what was going on in 2020 versus 2021. So, granted, things are arguably much worse. But with that said, we also have now a much greater understanding. We've also had, been functioning with businesses open and everything else open. And we've definitely found many more ways to adapt to the pandemic now than we did last year. And I think that's another variable to take into account. There's also the vaccination variable, which I don't know how things are in other countries, particularly in Japan. I know in the US, we're now at like 60% of people who are vaccinated. And so inherently, the maximum number of people who can actually get severely ill is considerably lower now than it was a year ago. So even if the number of infections are higher, the damage that can be done is also much less as well. So I see your point about the numbers being what they were, but there are certainly some differences that would have made things, more preparable for 2021 versus 2020.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course, in summer 2020, there were no vaccines at that point, certainly not in Japan, and I believe not in the US either at that point, right?
Correct.
Yeah, it was kind of around election time last year that the vaccine schedule was finally kind of on point there. And Japan was kind of lagging behind the rest of the world in terms of vaccines for a long time. Now we're more or less caught up with the US actually, but basically all of the vaccinations started from this February, I want to say.
Okay.
And I'm scheduled to finally get it 2 weeks from now, at least my
Okay.
first shot, because yeah, that's how backed up things have been. But at this
Sure.
point, I believe over half of the general population in Japan has been vaccinated, and 60% has had the first jab. So that's kind of on par with the US, although once again, we had been lagging. And at the time of the Olympics, we were definitely far behind many of the Western countries. It was not mandatory for athletes to get vaccinated, although most of them were. But I think for the Beijing Winter Olympics, it is going to be mandatory. And yeah, the vaccination protocol, I could have gotten vaccinated through the Olympics, and I kind of passed up on that chance because I already received a letter in the mail saying that I was eligible through my area of Tokyo, my local government. But when I tried to apply for the vaccine through that, they canceled on me because they said there weren't enough shipments of the vaccine in. So I tried to apply through the Olympics again, but they were all booked. So I kind of screwed that up. But it's no big deal. I mean, I don't expect to have any significant adverse reaction from either the COVID vaccine or COVID itself. So I don't mind waiting as long as, there's a legitimate reason for it. I'm not going to sit on my ass just not getting vaccinated. But on the other hand, I don't mind if I have to wait because elderly people have to get it first. So
Sure.
yeah. I'm planning to get that. But yeah, many of the people, like I said, who were volunteering with me, they were elderly, and many of them were already vaccinated by the time the Olympics and Paralympics started. Some of the younger people too, if they did it through the Olympics as well. But yeah, I mean, I was of the opinion that the Olympics should have been held in 2020 itself. Obviously, it got canceled, and I was, of course, of the opinion that it should be held in 2021 rather than indefinitely postponed and or completely canceled from Tokyo. And I'm glad they took place, and the Olympics naturally came on under a lot of fire for being held. But at the end of the day, I think people view it as a success and not as a factor in exacerbating the spread of the virus, although that information is in now. People seem to, in hindsight, 2020 hindsight, realize it wasn't such a big deal. At the time, there was a lot of consternation in the news, both from Japan and abroad. People criticizing it, saying that the Olympics shouldn't be held, that this is a disaster for the politicians involved. And actually, the Prime Minister of Japan is going to step down, and they're going to have some sort of like special process. I don't know. I don't follow Japanese politics all that closely, but yeah, basically because of the COVID numbers, the guy who was the most recent prime minister is going to be losing his job. Anyway, so let's get to the Olympics themselves. So for the Olympics, I was at beach volleyball, and for the Paralympics, I was at swimming. Once again, like, I don't know how I ended up at beach volleyball, but I kind of liked it there. I got to work mostly indoors, which is great because Tokyo is pretty hot and humid during the summer, and a lot of the athletes actually complained about it. Blame global warming if you want to. That's perhaps a factor, but in general, Tokyo summers are hot and humid. And one of my jobs was working at the Athletes Lounge at what's called the Sports Information Desk. And that's the information desk for the athletes and their coaches and assistants. So a typical day, I'd go there in the morning. Shifts were divided between, morning shift, afternoon shift, and evening shift. And initially I was scheduled to be there for like 10 days and to have kind of either generally 2 shifts a day. But once it was announced that there weren't going to be any spectators, I was actually assigned to a different department. So I was assigned from like the event services department to the sports information desk department. And at that point, I was only given 1 shift per day, which was a lot better for me because it meant that I could actually go home and get some work done. Taking 2 weeks off for the Olympics was kind of stressful at my job because my deadlines just kept piling up. At my job, it kind of sucks because even if you're not there that day, it's not like someone else does your work for you. You just have to keep waiting. And once you get back there, work twice as hard. So yeah, my schedule was a lot more lax and I was kind of thankful for that. But when I was there at the sports information desk, one of my jobs was scheduling, training courts for the athletes because, they want to train, they want to warm up, they want to plan for their matches against other teams. And very few teams scheduled anything during the afternoon because it was hot during the afternoon. They would either schedule the morning or the evening. So afternoon shifts were generally pretty lax. In the morning, I had to travel from where I live in central Tokyo out to the Odaiba area, which is also in Tokyo, but kind of by the shore. So I, took a 1-hour train there early in the morning. The earliest I've had to wake up in a very long time. I'd get to the specific site. I'd have to do a security check-in, and after like a 30-minute security check-in and getting actually to my spot at the venue, I basically just sit back and wait for the athletes and their coaches to come in. Once they'd come in, I'd schedule courts for them. I'd give them information about, when they'd have to get checked by the various, doping agencies and the officials and, other information that pertains to the athletes themselves. And sometimes after matches, they'd come back, they'd want, video recordings of the matches, and I'd provide those to them on USB. It was a pretty simple job, mostly at a desk, the sports information desk, mostly computer work. But I got to speak to a lot of the athletes, which was pretty cool. And also some of their coaches, depending on how big the team was. Like for Team USA, they have a lot of coaches and assistants. So I was mostly speaking to the coaches and assistants, not the players themselves. But for some of the other teams that were from like, countries that have less of an investment in beach volleyball, like Latvia, for example, the athletes themselves would come to the information desk and get all the information they needed for, all kinds of things. Also, scheduling for lunches, scheduling for the buses to come and pick them up. Because of the COVID protocols, they couldn't take general taxis and general buses. They would have to reserve specific taxis and specific buses and other means of transportations to get around. So they also did that at the sports information desk. But generally, I would not be in charge of that because there would be a Japanese person at the desk with me. And if they're going to be making phone calls in Japanese to the various taxi agencies, then I would leave that to the Japanese person. I, on the other hand, would be talking to most of the athletes because I'm the native English speaker there. And many of the others, like I said, they were good at English. But of course, if I'm the native speaker, I can communicate a little better. And as far as English level goes across the world, most of the Olympic athletes were able to speak very good English. It was typically just, the Eastern Asian athletes like China, Korea, Japan, who weren't going to speak English to the desk. They would typically, we also had a Chinese translator, and a few people did know Portuguese and Spanish, but they weren't always on shift. But typically these Portuguese or Spanish speakers would also speak English really well. All right, so that was basically beach volleyball. Because I was at the athletes lounge and like the practice course most of the time, I didn't get to see most of the matches. Kind of as a reward at the very end, I was allowed to see one of the matches. It was the women's match between Australia and Canada. And Australia, I believe they were the 5th seed. They upset Canada, the number 1 seed. And yeah, that was a really good match. I like watching beach volleyball, although I don't understand it that well. I've never played competitive volleyball, and I don't know exactly what the difference is between a really good volleyball player and a world-class volleyball player. It just looks like a fun sport to play. And so, yeah, I think that was pretty cool that I was able to get involved with beach volleyball, even though I don't play the sport myself. It was a fun place to go. And the area itself, Odaiba, it's a really cool location in Tokyo. Several of the Olympic events were held there, like rock climbing was held in the Odaiba area. And that was really cool. I mean, I don't know if you got to see any rock climbing, but there were some really cool pictures taken of the rock climbers climbing up one of those walls and then a giant Gundam robot standing in the background. So that was held kind of fairly close to where I was at beach volleyball. Some of the other water events like rowing, I believe, were held in that general area. And yeah, it was cool. So for as a volunteer, I don't get paid by the hour or anything, but they did pay for my transportation at least to, the event site and back to my home, up to 1,000 yen, which was barely enough for me. But some people came from farther away, and their transportation costs were not offset. And they would give us like a free lunch when we were there. So lunch was typically, some like if you're familiar with Japanese, culture, you might see one of these convenience store bentos or little microwavable lunch boxes when you watch anime. And I was basically given something like that, plus a Coca-Cola brand drink because Coca-Cola was a sponsors, which was, either Coca-Cola itself, Aquarius, which is like a sports drink, some coffee drinks, or just like a bottle of water. And yeah, sometimes we were given like random, fruits or chocolate, depending on what was in there for the day. But the supply line for food was really screwed up by the fact that there were no spectators, no general spectators, which, like I said, meant that I had to be transferred to a different team for volunteering. A lot of the volunteers were either cut or their hours were reduced. So there was a lot of extra food. That was a scandal in and of itself here because Japanese people hate wasting food. And that was annoying too. So I just tried to eat what I could. But yeah, I mean, as a volunteer, those are your perks. You got your transportation paid for, you got a free meal, and you got some little pins, depending on how many days you were there. So I actually have them right beside me. Give me 1 second. Yeah, so like if you were there for enough days, you got the character badges with the official Tokyo 2020 characters, Mirai Toa and Sameiri. So yeah, gold, silver, bronze, depending on how many days you volunteered. So I was able to collect them all. Yeah. And yeah, that's basically my experience from the Olympic side. So let's just pause here. You have any questions about what the Olympics were like for me or about the Olympics in general?
All right, first and foremost, I don't think you mentioned it. What made you decide to do this in the first place?
Ah, yes, yes, yes. It's kind of funny. Like when I told some of my coworkers that I was volunteering, because they were some of the first people I told, they asked me, "Oh yeah, so what are you getting paid, or like what are you getting compensated for it?" And I'm like, "Nah, I'm just doing it for free, right?" And they kind of looked at me as if I was a sucker or something. I was kind of familiar with the concept of the Olympics having a lot of volunteers involved, so it just seemed like a normal thing to me. But yeah, I understand if people would not want to do it unless they were paid for their labor. We're going to talk about the concept of volunteering a little later on in more depth, but yeah, I just think the Olympics are cool, and I've been watching them ever since I was a kid. Pretty much every year on TV that it's on, winter or summer. Even the Winter Olympics, I've never done a Winter Olympic sport, but just the fact that it's on TV and it's sports, I enjoy sports. I enjoy watching world level competition. I think it's cool, and living in the host city for the Olympics, that is an experience, or at least it should have been, if not for the pandemic. There wasn't much going on here during the Olympics, and actually the athletes themselves were not allowed to leave the athletes village without special permissions or anything like that. So yeah, I just thought it would be fun. And I know that the Olympics is really hard to host if you don't have a huge army of volunteers. I enjoy this stuff. I enjoy sports. So I figured it would be fun. I know that there are a lot of criticisms of the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, how they are kind of corrupt, and, they, they have a lot of sketchy practices. So the argument could be made that, yeah, they could afford to, pay people to volunteer, and they shouldn't run off, people volunteering their time when they're making money behind, closed doors. But yeah, long story short, there's no other explanation than I thought it would be fun, and it would be, an interesting experience that I might not be able to experience again at any other point in my life. It's just kind of a coincidence that I was going to be in Tokyo during the Olympics.
Sure.
That's basically all. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Also, I guess it was a good chance to put my language skills to the test, and I failed on more than one occasion. I'm not going to lie. So I'm studying Spanish. I studied Spanish back in high school. I actually got really good grades back in high school, and I do like Duolingo on my phone every day. But man, sometimes when the people from Spanish-speaking countries came in, tried to speak to them a little in Spanish, and I fell flat on my face. So that was at least fun to give it a shot, but it's hard to speak two different foreign languages at once, to constantly flip back between them. And yeah, speaking itself specifically, like you don't really get much speaking practice on your phone, on your, your applications like Duolingo. So I would have to sit there and think of the right words instead of just flowing out of me naturally. If I really buckled down and studied Spanish seriously, I could be reasonably good at speaking in a year. It's much easier. Spanish is much easier for native English speakers than Japanese. So my Spanish could be at least as good as my Japanese if I tried hard. But the fact is, as long as I'm in Japan, I'm going to continuously be studying Japanese, and I see no end in sight to that. So my Spanish is always going to take a backseat, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, you know, that's how you learn, by making mistakes and by just going through a slow process. It's very difficult, especially when there's not a lot of people that you can practice with.
Yeah.
So it's a learning curve.
Especially with me, like sometimes I try to hide the fact that I knew any Spanish, but when I have my mask on and someone's coming from a foreign country into Japan where everyone is, well, where almost everyone is racially Japanese, or the remaining volunteers are often Chinese because they need a lot of Chinese or Korean translators. So they see someone like me and they think, yeah, this guy can probably speak a little Spanish. Let me test this guy out. And I would always embarrass myself. But yeah, the words that you mess up on, those are the words you always remember the most afterwards. So
Exactly.
it's still a good experience, but I'm kind of disappointed in myself. And next time any opportunity to speak Spanish comes around, I hope I do a little better.
Okay, fair
Yeah.
enough.
By the way, just completely off topic, how's your Spanish these days, by the way? Do you actually end up speaking once in a while at your workplace or in social circumstances? Because I know you've, you studied abroad briefly in Peru. Your Spanish was pretty good back then. How's it these days?
I mean, I don't think I'll ever be as good as I was during my month in South America when I was using it every day.
Mm-hmm.
Inherently, you don't use it, you lose it on some level. I mean, I can still speak conversational Spanish. I can still, go up to patients who don't speak English and take histories in Spanish. I think I can speak reasonable conversational Spanish to most coworkers who are fluent speakers. I think at this point, the only way I would get better is if I went back to some predominantly Spanish-speaking country and lived there again. But I do think I speak well enough that I could carry a conversation and I can understand most people. And I think most people are courteous enough that if they knew that I'm not a native speaker, that they would, probably speak a little bit slower and, probably in a way that I'd be able to understand them as well.
Yeah. Also, one of the problems with these kinds of study programs is that they speak a little too clearly and a little too slowly. So when you have some random old men talking to you in their old man accents, you have no idea what they're saying, even if they slowed down and spoke a little more clearly. Oh yeah, you just want to find like your seat. Okay, cool, it's right over there. But yeah, okay. So yeah, any other questions about the Olympics before we get to the Paralympics?
I guess this goes along with the Olympics, but also to the Paralympics on some level. I'm sure you had some interaction with the athletes during your time there. And was it what you expected them to be, or, were they different on a more personal level?
Okay. I didn't get to really interact with any of the Paralympic athletes because I was in a different section, and I'll get to that later. But yeah, I got to interact with a bunch of the beach volleyball athletes. They were really chill, and maybe that's the nature of the sport, that they were all like really friendly and seemed to get along with each other. Like the different countries' teams, there was no tension in the atmosphere whatsoever. They were all like really friendly with each other, had no problem sharing space, completely polite towards each other. My image of the Olympics before going into this was that perhaps some of the countries would be like that, but if there were geopolitical tensions between, say, the US and China, those two teams might not want to be in the same room at the same time. But for beach volleyball, let me give you an example here. Sometimes we'd have a little lost and found area if someone left something at the practice court, and we'd put that in the lost and found area. Someone from another team might come over and say, oh, hey, is that that looks like it belongs to the team from Brazil. I actually have that coach's phone number. I could send them a text message and pass along word that they have it here, even though that team is from like, Switzerland or something. So that was really cool that everyone was getting along. Everyone was on speaking terms, that they had a lot of each other's contact information. When we reserved courts, typically we would reserve a court for one country's team at a time, but some of them were totally okay with practicing together, even if they were rivals. Like the US and Canada were practicing together, even though there was a very good chance that those two would go up against each other at some point in the playoffs. And I thought that was really cool, that everyone was really friendly and they got along. China, China, I spoke to some of their athletes. They were really cool. They spoke a little bit of English. They weren't super fluent or anything, but they seemed like really nice people. I spoke to, Team Cuba, a team that, a country that doesn't really get along well with the United States, but the Cuban women, they were, extremely friendly, super nice people. Like I can't say I had any negative interaction with the athletes at all. And I didn't see anything that I would consider against, the gentleman's rules of sportsmanship and the spirit of the Olympics of everyone coming together. So I was really really pleased about that, and I can't say the same thing went on for every sport. Beach volleyball, you have the idea of people just lounging at the beach playing a game for fun under the sun, so maybe that has something to do with the beach volleyball culture. But yeah, I was very happy to see that everyone was just getting along.
Great. No, that's awesome.
Yeah. I think the Paralympics, based on what little I was able to see, it has more of a camaraderie atmosphere because everyone has to struggle a little bit more to get there. And it's not necessarily as competitive against other teams and other countries as they are against like themselves. Like everyone's going for their personal records more so than the Paralympic record or the world record. And the way that they structure the Paralympics, they structure it such that it's not necessarily country against country. It's sort of country against country for sure, but there are many different categories for disabilities. So, for example, there's like a level 1 through level 10 for swimming about how I guess how much of an obstacle your disability is, and you get gold, silver, and bronze for each of those categories. So it's subdivided a lot. There are a lot of medals to go around, and any one given medal doesn't mean more than the other. It's not like swimming events at the Olympics where there's 1 silver, 1 gold, 1 bronze, and if you were in the third heat in the qualifiers and you lost, that was the end for you. So yeah, everyone seemed to get along at the Paralympics, and at the Olympics too. I was surprised by how well everyone did get along. Okay. Yeah, got anything else? Yeah.
It was something like the Paralympics, considering that it's a very broad event with a lot of different sports, with a lot of different people, with a lot of different disabilities. During competitions, were people matched up against people with similar disabilities to them, or was it like anybody with any sort of issue was pitted up against each other? Because I could see that, some being at a clear advantage than others based on that, or was that not the case?
Yeah. So that's kind of hard to describe, honestly, because I don't know the specific process. There were 3 categories for 3 broad categories for swimming, and then there was subdivided by degree of difficulty. So the 3 broad categories for swimming, and I think swimming probably had more Paralympic events than anything else. I could be wrong about that, but there were a ton of swimming events. So there were 3 broad categories for Paralympic swimming. There was physical disabilities, and that was level 1 through 10. Then there's, physical disabilities, not including vision problems. Then there was 3 separate categories, 3 separate subcategories for people with visual impairments. And then there was a final category for intellectual impairments. So those 3 were in completely different divisions: visual impairments, physical impairments, and intellectual impairments. And then for physical impairments, there were categories 1 through 10, depending on severity. And typically that meant if you were in category 1 or 2, you had multiple limbs missing. You might have, typically missing limbs were grouped similarly. Let's see, there was like, I don't know the proper medical or politically correct terminology here, but like dwarfism was a fairly common one. So people who were just naturally much shorter than the average person. People with some level of paralysis, but it wasn't like they separated the paralyzed people from the people who had completely missing limbs. They would often compete against each other. So how do you measure, a partially paralyzed person versus someone with 2 working limbs and 2 non-working limbs, or 2 missing limbs entirely? It's hard to say exactly. So I think a lot of it has to do with the times they were able to get during qualifiers and during other worldwide competitions. I don't know strictly if it's based entirely on time or also based on a combination of time and the type of disability, but yeah, my impression is that it was largely based on the time that that kind of person was able to get at prior events, plus the general kind of disability that they had. And yeah, at the Paralympics, swimming, you're allowed to modify your stroke basically any way you want, as long as it helps you swim. I guess that's the purpose of the Paralympics, right? Even if you're missing a limb or two, or you have some kind of paralysis or dwarfism, or some sort of deformity where your arm bends in perhaps the wrong way, you have to find a way to swim that isn't conventional, but that can nonetheless get you to the finish line. So there are a lot of different kinds of disabilities that all were in the same bracket, but I guess they were separated largely depending on their time. So you might have people in category 2 with 2 missing limbs, and you might have someone in category 4 with 2 missing limbs. It's just that the person in category 4 was able to put up better times for one reason or another. Can't say exactly how. I could probably look more into this later, but that was just my general impression. It's based partly on their times and partly on their type of disability.
Okay, makes sense.
Okay, so yeah, actually, let's use that as a segue to start talking about the Paralympics. So my Paralympics position didn't change from what I was initially given during the application process. So once again, going back to the application process, after like those first 2 events, the online application and the in-person application and the in-person interview, they offer you a position. You can decline that if you want to or accept it. I accepted both of the positions that were given to me. And then for the Olympics, I was shifted from event services to the sports information desk for beach volleyball. And for the Paralympics, I was on what's called protocol. And I wasn't sure exactly what that meant until I actually had my in-person training session for that role just a few weeks before the Paralympics started. But basically, I was a bouncer. I got a very high clearance from, I guess, the Japanese equivalent of the FBI or whatever other police sort of bureaucracy looks into your background. So they checked my background and they gave me a very high clearance level. So I was at what's called, I guess, the Paralympic family, which some people confused for being the relatives of the athletes, like real family. But no, this is corporate family and sort of sponsors or VIPs, sometimes foreign guests from like foreign dignitaries, things like that. So basically people with very high clearance levels, sort of VIPs at the Paralympics. And if they were allowed to enter, I let them in. If they were not allowed to enter, I had to say, sorry, you can't come in. And that was basically my entire role for the Paralympics. I was at the Tokyo Aquatic Center. It was the pool that they used for the Olympics, a beautiful natatorium, which is the fancy word for a swimming pool building. But yeah, there were basically 3 different positions within that building that I'd be working at, all within the general area of the Paralympic family entrance. In fact, I have my, let's see. Yeah, there we go. So let me just cover up my name here. This is what my ID badge looked like. And this number 6 here, that was the security clearance for the Paralympic family area. So if someone came in with a name tag and they had the number 6, I let them in. And if they had a different number, I couldn't let them in. And everyone had one of these who was involved with the Olympics, including the athletes, including the coaches. You had to use this to sign in to get into your different clearance areas. And I wasn't allowed to go into areas without the number 6, actually. So the number 2 was used for athletes areas. I couldn't go there. Athletes couldn't come into my area. There were 3 different sub positions within the Paralympic family area that I was assigned, that I sort of rotated through as my sort of bouncer role. One was at the very entrance to the Paralympic family area. And this was often the most difficult because this is where people would come in the first place and they might have some mistake about whether they were allowed to come in or not. The biggest problem that I had at that area, sometimes you'd have someone coming from a different country who had the proper clearance, but their translator didn't. So they were allowed to come in, but their translator had to wait outside. And some people were understandably upset about this. But the rules are the rules. You don't know if one of these people having, a regular ID badge, but not having gone through the proper security clearances might attack a foreign dignitary, and that would be an absolute mess at the Olympics or the Paralympics. So yeah, just for the security's sake, only people with a specific number were allowed to come in. And yeah, once we allowed these people in, they could use any of the other 2 areas that I was assigned to. So the other areas that I was assigned to, one was by the pool side, by the the seating area for the Paralympic family, which as VIPs, they had some of the best seats in the house. So it was a fairly small seating area, but it was right by the center of the pool area, fairly low. And this was generally not full because obviously they kept general spectators out, but some of these VIP guests, they were allowed in, they could watch the events. On a typical day, we'd have maybe a peak of 20 of them by the pool at any given time. So once again, not a lot of people there, but if they're the head of marketing for Coca-Cola, they're allowed in. If they're the vice president of the Paralympic Committee, they're allowed in. If they're a dignitary from Uzbekistan, they're allowed in. That kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the other area that I was assigned to, aside from the entrance area and the poolside Paralympic family area, was kind of the Paralympic Lounge, where they would go to eat, they would go to rest. There was a restroom specifically there for them that nobody else could use. So sometimes if a journalist wanted to come in and use the restroom, I'd say, no, this is for the Paralympic family only, sorry. And after the first few days, people kind of understood where they had to be and things got a lot more lax. But on the first few days, not everyone knew where they had to be or where they were allowed to be. So at first, and also those being my first few days at the Paralympics, I was unsure whether people... Sometimes it wasn't as simple as they had the number 6, they were allowed to come in or not. Some people got temporary permission that very day. Some people, if they were also volunteers, but they were transferred between groups, they were allowed to come in even if they weren't given the number 6 beforehand. So I had my original badge with the number 6, but for example, when I was working on beach volleyball, I didn't have the number 2 on my badge, which was the athlete's number, because I was originally not supposed to be with the athletes, but I was transferred to an area with the athletes and I had to get my card upgraded every single day. Kind of annoying, but that's the security process. So that's basically what I did. I had those 3 mini areas within the general Paralympic family area in the pool building, and I had to turn away people who were not allowed to enter. Along with that, I got to see a lot of events, actually. So in the second area within the Paralympic family area, the seating area, right by the pool, and people didn't enter or exit all that much at any given time. Like I said, there were generally at most 20 people there at any given time, so I didn't have all that much to do. I got to see a lot of the events. Some of these athletes are actually really impressive. I think one of the most common misconceptions about the Paralympics is that it's a sort of, I guess, everyone gets a medal kind of event or something where anyone can join if they really want to. It's about participation more than competitiveness. And to some degree, that is true because they do have the different categories. But these people are legit athletes and they are really impressive for their time. So we were swimmers in high school. We have an idea of, what a good time is in the various events. And some of these people, even in the really low levels, like level 1 or 2 for physical disabilities, you had people there who had maybe one functioning limb or even no, functioning limbs. They might just have like a stump across their entire body, and they just do the butterfly kick, basically, just bouncing up and down from the beginning to the end of the pool. And you think, well, I guess that's the best they can do. Cool for them that they are able to swim despite having their disabilities. And then you look at the times, and you're like, wait a minute. They just swam 50 meters in like 2.5 minutes. They shouldn't be able to do that without any functioning limbs. That's ridiculous. So I was pretty damn impressed by how fast some of them were. And once it got to the level where they might only be missing one limb, they were all faster than I ever was. Like they'd be swimming, their 100-meter freestyle in under a minute. And I was never able to do that. Like that is really, really impressive. So they are legit athletes and I do have a lot of respect for them. It doesn't necessarily make for great TV because once again, it's not competitive in the sense that you have so many different physical disabilities competing against each other that the competition itself doesn't necessarily seem like an even playing field, or it doesn't necessarily have an intuitive sense to it. Whereas when you have the Olympics with fully able-bodied people up against each other, the difference in times is extremely small. So that's a much more fun event to watch in terms of the pure competition, seeing everyone do the absolute best they can, trying to beat each other. But watching these people swim very respectable times despite having severe disabilities, yeah, it's really impressive, and they have my respect.
You know, this is reminding me of a similar instance from high school,
Mhm.
which I witnessed, probably the closest thing I've ever witnessed to this. I don't know if you were there or not, but I'm suddenly reminded of a year when we had an assembly, and there was this guy who, I believe he had one arm, and he challenged our volleyball teams to a match, and including the girls team, the boys team, and the teachers team, I believe.
Yes,
And
yes, I remember that. Yeah.
yes, this guy single-handedly beat the girls volleyball team and the teachers volleyball team. He lost to the boys volleyball team, but that was also his last match.
Mhm.
And he probably was a little bit tired after that. But again, just goes to show that, one arm, one person beating a whole team of people by themselves. It just goes to show, again, reiterating what you're saying, just how impressive some of these athletes are.
Yeah, yeah, I remember that assembly. That was really cool. And yeah, yes, he did lose to our boys volleyball team, but our boys volleyball team was incredibly good. They were legit like a state title level competitive. And this guy's record against volleyball teams, he typically, when he goes to different schools, he challenges the girls, the boys, and the teachers, right? He typically wins against all three. So yeah, really impressive guy. And even aside from his missing one arm, I remember his general appearance. He was kind of like a chubby middle-aged man. He didn't really have the body of an athlete aside from that one missing limb. Like a lot of these swimmer athletes, even if they were missing a limb, everything else about them screamed Olympic swimmer. They had like a perfect swimmer's body, six-pack abs, very little body fat, muscular shoulders. So that guy was really impressive. I hadn't even thought about that guy in a very long time, but yeah, yeah. I mean, just because you have some disability doesn't mean you can't be much, much better at sports than someone who is, quote, physically abled, right? So, uh, yeah, I didn't get to watch much of the other Paralympic events on TV because I was swamped with work, and the days that I wasn't at the pool center, I couldn't really watch much TV, but I did watch a little bit of the other sports. I saw a little bit of like wheelchair rugby and wheelchair basketball. One guy on the Japanese team in wheelchair basketball, he was shooting something along the lines of 60% from 3-point range. And that
Hmm.
is ridiculous. I mean, you watch a little basketball, like if you can shoot
Oh, sure.
40% from 3-point range, that's considered to be elite, right? 60%, more than half of your shots from 3-point range from a wheelchair, that is incredible. So yeah, some of these athletes, I don't know how they do it, but they are legitimately impressive.
Sure. Definitely.
All right, so what else do I have from the Paralympics? I mean, do you have any questions for me? Because my role there, it's kind of like I said, just being a bouncer. Um, that was mostly all there was to it for me. But if you have any questions, go ahead, shoot.
None that I can think of right now. I feel like we covered most of it.
All right, cool. Well, yeah. So I think one thing that I want to say is that I did have to do like a PCR COVID test during the Olympics. I only ended up having to do it once. I probably should have done it more, but I guess they only made me do it once. Technically, I
Hmm.
was separated from the athletes by like a glass wall that you see at cash registers sometime, but yeah, sometimes I would have to enter the athletes area to set something up or to let people in, or for some reason or another. I probably should have been tested more for that. But for the most part, I think COVID restrictions were taken extremely seriously at the Olympics. Like I said, the taxis, the buses, those were all separated from the general population. Some people from the various delegations did get caught breaking their curfews or breaking whatever rules they had about staying at the Olympic Village, but for the most part, everyone stayed there. I wasn't at the Olympic Village. I never got around to going there. I never had any business there, but I do know one person who was volunteering there as a translator. She was like, she speaks English and French fluently and is extremely good at Japanese as well. So really high level at all three of those. And yeah, I saw some of the pictures from the Olympic Village. It always seems like a fun place to be, but because of the COVID restrictions, a lot of teams didn't really interact with each other, or at least officially they didn't. I don't know what some of these people are doing after dark, but Yeah, I did for the Paralympics. I was tested more often with the PCR test for COVID, even though I had basically nothing to do with the athletes themselves. I guess they didn't want me interacting with the foreign guests or the high level VIP guests without really being safe and sure that I didn't have COVID. And yeah, the food situation was the same. They paid for transportations, they paid for our our lunch, and yeah, that's basically all there was to that. So yeah, I guess that's all for the Olympics and Paralympics for now. If any of you in the audience have any questions about the Olympics or Paralympics, feel free to leave comments and I can answer that at a later time. One thing that I forgot to mention is that a lot of the beach volleyball players were Haikyuu fans. So are you familiar with that? I know many of my viewers are anime fans and they at least know about Haikyuu, even if they haven't watched it. It's a volleyball anime. You seen it?
I have seen Haikyuu.
Seriously. Okay, because I
Mm-hmm.
know you don't watch that much anime these days, but that's a pretty big one over the past few years.
Yeah, no, this was introduced to by some mutual friends and family members. So,
Okay, yeah, because the way I found this out was that one of the other people on my volunteer team, they would like draw random pictures of Haikyuu characters or other people like the mascot characters for the Olympics. Sometimes they do origami. They'd like to decorate the room basically because it was the athletes' lounge. They wanted to create a sort of Japanese atmosphere, and many people stopped like the Haikyuu characters and like, oh, that's really good actually. I know that guy. That's Hinata, and like, oh damn, these people watch Haikyuu.
hmm.
So yeah, go figure. A lot of these Japanese culture is spreading, even these random ass sports anime. They're known worldwide by Olympic athletes. Anyway, on to the second part of our video today. We're going to talk about volunteering at a hospital, something that this guy dragged me into back when we were in high school. So tell me, what made you decide to give that a shot?
Okay, so people volunteer generally for two different reasons.
Mhm.
One, they have a sincere, legitimate interest in doing something, and they think it would actually be fun and a good use of their time. Example, you volunteering for the Olympics.
Okay.
Other people volunteer for something because they have some sort of secondary or ulterior goal, and they feel that by volunteering their time, it'll help them achieve that goal,
Mhm.
like me at the time.
Yeah.
So I'm a physician. My dream had always been to be a physician from a fairly young age. And around the time in high school, it was a time where I was starting to get ready to prepare an application and prepare a resume and impress various colleges, medical schools, etc. And I'd heard from many people that some level of volunteer experience was necessary in order to do that. And so the summer after 10th grade, I really didn't have anything better to do with my time. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to at least get some volunteer experience on my resume and just put it out there.
Mhm.
So that was my motivation. Of course, you know, I expressed an interest in volunteering, and of course, our mom decided to sign both of us up for
Yeah.
whatever reason. So
I mean,
instead, we both
yeah.
got dragged into it.
Yeah, I wasn't entirely opposed to it. Obviously, I participated, but yeah, it was once again, this is something I can put on my college application someday. I know I don't really want to be a doctor. I don't particularly want to work at a hospital. In fact, at that point in time, so it was the summer after ninth grade for me. I remember I was kind of dabbling around in HTML for the first time because our father bought like this HTML book, and I was looking through and like, hey, well, maybe I can build a really basic website or something, see how that goes, and maybe that'll be more relevant to my future. But it was just a few hours a week and someplace for us to go at the same time. Yeah, why the heck not? Maybe I'll get something out of it, something I can, at least put on my college application in the future. And maybe if I am actually interested in what I see there, it could serve me in a future career. But even if not, I'm always doing things that I don't particularly care for because it's going to boost my college application. So this was no different to me.
Sure. Yeah. It was something that a lot of people do.
Mhm.
Um, so, we did it. Primarily, it was limited to that summer and maybe a little bit into fall
Mhm.
before I got especially busy with academics and things like that. The local hospital for us. And then somehow one way or the other, we just sort of fell out of it. We did a few different things that I remember. One thing I was big on was there was a little while where we sat at the front desk and did communications and things like that.
Mhm.
And then there was one time for a little while where we went to the dietary department and just took out meals and dropped them off in different rooms,
Mhm.
and did things like that. So we lasted, or at least I lasted there for maybe a few months, and then things started to get busier. I had to get ready for SATs and things like that. During my senior year of high school, I tried to give volunteering another shot, and this time I went to a local university hospital to volunteer over there. I only did maybe 3 or 4 shifts there, thinking that, okay, this is a bigger medical center at a place that has a medical school, has a residency. Maybe it might be better to help get my name out there. That experience was actually much more disorganized with much less for me to do, which is part of the reason I only worked 3 or 4 shifts there. And, before I said, this isn't worth my time, quite honestly.
Okay.
Um,
I hadn't heard much about that one because obviously I wasn't there, but yeah, I was there with you at the first hospital, and I was at the front desk for a while. And after that, I was like, well, this isn't, basically what our opinion was, as I recall, was that this isn't helping to prepare us for a future in medicine, or if that's the goal. So let's try something else. So we requested to be sent to a different department. They sent us to the kitchen, and delivering meals. Once again, it's not something that was really gonna help us out in any way, learn about medicine, or we at least saw a little more of the hospital that way. We saw some of the patients, but once again, I didn't really get anything out of that. In fact, the whole hospital environment is just kind of depressing for me. I'm sure you feel differently about this than I do, but when I see people sick in bed, my reaction isn't I want to help them. It's like, man, I just want to get out of here. And then I remember the third department that I was sent to was the mail room. So they sent me there. I would just take this whole bucket of mail, stick it in different mail slots. And I did that for like a month or 2 at most. And I was like, you know what? This is not going to get any better. So I'm out of here. But what other department were you in after the kitchen, if any? Because I don't recall where you went to after that.
I may have been a little bit in the mailroom at that place. Those were the
Oh,
only that I may have been. I don't even
okay.
remember anymore. But if I was, it was just for a day or two tops. Realistically speaking, that was about it. What I did at the university hospital was even less, which again, there was less guidance, and I was the only one doing it. So I was pretty much there, clock in and do whatever you want for X number of hours. And that was it. So I think one preconception that I think people have about volunteer work is that it prepares you in any meaningful way for healthcare. And that could not be further from the truth, especially as a high school student. You're going to have very little interaction with any actual healthcare workers. Whatever you're doing, you're more likely to get in their way than not. And it really doesn't help you practice medicine. I think that's what, other people, in particular, parents and friends and whoever else thought we were doing, but really, there's very little for you to do that actually is relevant to the practice of medicine when you're a volunteer. Really what it is a stepping stone. Really what it is that, when you apply to medical school to see, well, are you, quote, altruistic? Are you willing to do scut work and, busy work, all for the sake of showing your commitment to healthcare? Which, you have your share of busy work and all that stuff, no matter what level you're at. I have that share of busy work now as a fully trained physician. So it's more of an issue of, well, are you willing to put your time into it and do these things rather than, oh, are you skilled enough to be a physician?
Yeah, something else that you mentioned that I agree with, or at least it makes a lot of sense to me, is that I got the sense that a lot of these hospitals, at least the one that we were at, and it sounds like it was even more so the case the second place that you went to, they are swamped with volunteers because they all have the same thing in mind. This is something that would look really good to put on our college application. It's a good introduction to the healthcare environment. And so they actually have more volunteers than they know what to do with. And
Mhm.
I also get the sense that because of that, they didn't really care so much about us individually, or they weren't all that invested in making sure that we had a really good experience. They were just like, hey, go there, sift through some mail. Hey, go there, write some labels to stick on these little these meals that you're going to push around. So for me, I honestly, I got nothing out of it except it more so that it just solidified the fact that I did not want to ever work in a hospital. So let me ask you this now. So you've been through medical school, you've been a doctor, you've practiced in various environments. Have you seen anything in those environments from volunteers or volunteer programs that has changed your mind in any way about volunteering at a hospital since your experiences in high school?
Well, we do see volunteers fairly frequently.
Hmm.
I saw them at the places that I trained in residency. I see them now at this hospital, which is a much smaller community hospital compared to the universities that I worked in trading. So they're there. Um, Again, they're mainly there to try to help out here and whenever they can, moving patients from one area to another, maybe direct people here and there. And now a lot of times I see a mix of things. You do see the younger students who are trying to get up in the world and start somewhere. But then you also see a lot of them being older people who might be retired and just have a lot of free time and just want to do something with it. So I mean, the quality of work isn't really that much different. I don't really have significant personal interaction with them, but they are there, and they all have their different reasons. I don't think any of them really contribute to patient care in the traditional sense that most people think of.
Mhm.
But they are just doing whatever little part they can. So that's all there is to it.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the elderly volunteers because that's something that I saw a lot at the Tokyo Olympics. A lot of these volunteers were retirees who had a lot of free time and just kind of wanted something to do. And I think that's really important actually. Once you're retired, that you don't just completely stop being productive with your life, because I think that's a really fast way to an early grave. You got to keep
Mhm.
busy somehow or another. And
Yeah.
something that I experienced working with a lot of these old retirees was kind of that old-fashioned Japanese work culture. Because a lot of the
Hmm.
people I've worked with in Japan, yeah, I mean, some of them are, in their 50s or early 60s, but most of them are kind of younger than that, actually, in the various schools that I've worked in and my current job. I'd say the average age is, 30s or 40s. So some of these people who I'm working with who are in their late 60s, 70s, maybe even in their 80s, they come from sort of a different era where Japanese workers back then, I mean, Japanese workers even now are kind of hardcore, but even back then more so. And they would always look for every excuse they had to do something that might be useful, even if they weren't told. Okay, so like I was saying, I got to experience working with this whole like prior generation of Japanese people who, many of which had this really strong work ethic in which they couldn't just stand around and seemingly do nothing. They had to try to find ways to be productive. Like that one guy I was working with, really old guy who would always like he could, even if he didn't see anyone who he would need to let in or keep out, he would just go around cleaning off tables. He would try to wipe off handrails, disinfect things. He would try to organize the chairs. He would try to do anything he could to try to be productive and help people out at his a volunteer workplace, even if no one told him to do that, and even if the chance of that actually making a difference was next to nothing, it was still something. So yeah, that was kind of interesting. And yeah, I can imagine that some of the elderly people who volunteer at hospitals, maybe they find some personal worth in it, or maybe like, okay, so let me skip to one of my next questions actually. Is there anything that's like a volunteer job that isn't something that you can put a price on? For example, just spending time with people in the hospital, talking to them. Maybe some of these people are in hospices or they have like terminal illnesses and they just want someone to keep them from being lonely. Are there volunteer positions like that?
I mean, I'm sure there are.
Mhm.
Truth be told, that's something that the volunteer department would know better. it's not something that I spent a significant time doing in any of my volunteer gigs, not through high school or through college. But, I'm sure there's people out there who would do that kind of thing, Most of the time, though, it's, family members or friends or things like that who are usually with their, rather than some, for lack
Okay.
of a better word, some random stranger.
Yeah, because I keep trying to process this in my mind. Like, what is the worth of being a volunteer at a hospital? What does it mean for the volunteers? What does it mean for the hospital itself? What value do you provide that a paid job couldn't? And something like spending time with the sick, keeping people company, maybe that has some emotional fulfillment that you can't really pay someone to do exactly. But if you're just sorting mail or pushing a food cart around, I mean, I don't see what's so fulfilling about that if your mind isn't thinking about the bigger picture of just helping the hospital generally. So let me ask you, from the hospital side or the healthcare provider side, what's the value in having a volunteer program for the hospital?
I would say that it takes busy work, quote unquote, that a paid employee would otherwise have to do, and it would allocate that task to somebody else who can then, do those things while the paid employees do, quote unquote, more important things. For example, a nurse in an ICU, or even the nurse's assistant, the nurse's aide, the patient care assistant, who usually does a lot of the, quote, bedside busy work for many cases in many places. That person would have to do things like, move patients up and down in different rooms, or possibly pick up belongings here and there, or get gifts and whatnot. So those are the kinds of things that maybe a volunteer might do, so that PCA, the nurse's aide, might be able to do some of their tasks, which in turn would allow the nurses to do more of their tasks and focusing on their things, which would allow physicians to do some of our tasks, so it does sort of translate up on some level.
Okay.
And that's probably the best way I would say it would help.
All right. So are you of the opinion that volunteer programs for hospitals actually do save the hospitals money, or is it more like they save the hospitals sort of time and labor, or some combination of both?
I would say it saves labor for the hospital workers. I would say it makes our jobs a little bit easier, so that, and I think that's probably the biggest benefit to having a volunteer program.
Okay. And any idea, just any proposals or just ideas off the top of your head about what hospitals might do to make volunteer programs better, or better experiences for the volunteers? Or is there any incentive for hospitals to do that, given that so many high school kids want to volunteer because they believe it'll help them with their college applications?
I think the best way to do it is, when you look at different volunteers and their application, maybe throwing in a couple of questions about, what they might hope to gain from the experience. Not necessarily as a means to accept or reject applicants, but more so to say, well, all right, this person is trying to get a little bit more clinical experience. This person may have an interest in healthcare. Maybe they can be paired up. When I was in college, I volunteered at another university center for some time. And this was a place that, I ultimately ended up doing my residency. But I volunteered at this place, and me and my college classmates had volunteered there under the premise of, well, if we work at this place, they made an agreement, say, do 40 hours, which was then up to 80 hours of volunteer work. And they said, once we do 80 hours volunteer work, we'll try to set you up with somebody who can then, maybe do research with you. So that was my ultimate motive. I volunteered there. I picked a day where I barely had any class load, and I'd spend like 8 hours there. And then after maybe 10 days of doing that, I had accumulated 80 hours of total work week, at which point they did set me up with somebody, and I did have some basic research assignment.
All right. Well, at least they pulled through with that. That's nice.
Yeah. Now, granted, as a college student, again, the level of interaction and the level of things that I'd be able to do was very, very minimal.
Mm.
Nonetheless, it was some experience. I don't know how much it actually helped with me getting into medical school or residency, but it was something to do. There was an end goal there. So, maybe setting something up like that might make it more worthwhile for the applicants and the volunteers.
Yeah, that's cool. All right, then. You have any final thoughts on the volunteer programs, or I guess that answers all of my questions.
I mean, I guess I would say that if you're going to volunteer, just make sure your expectations are reasonable. You're not going to be a volunteer as a high school student, go in and do brain surgery or do any meaningful part of patient care as a high school student.
Mhm.
You are most likely going to be doing busy work that has nothing to do with healthcare. Just recognize that, it is a means to an end. Just go in there with a realistic expectation. Know that in some way you are helping somebody, so that's something to get from it as well. And just try to make the best of it. It is a long process that has very late returns, and that's the first step to seeing if you're willing to stick it out.
All right, cool. Well, thanks for answering all those questions about volunteering at a hospital. And that brings us to the end of our second episode of JDMD. As always, I'm Baka-Raptor from based in Japan, a lawyer here, and hopefully next time we'll get to a legal topic as well. But just wanted to rep the Olympics one last time. And of course, Allopathasaurus from the US. See you later.
Peace out.